Snow fell like silent ash over the forbidden city, thick, white, endless. Beneath the crimson eaves and golden roofs, an empire blurred quietly. In the great audience hall, a throne of jade and gold stood beneath the eyes of dragons carved into the ceiling. Upon it sat a boy no taller than the armrest, his legs dangling, his hands trembling beneath the weight of heaven itself. He was 8 years old, his name Azen Joro Swani, soon to be known to the world as Emperor Kangxi. The boy's crown gleamed brighter than his gaze, but his small face betrayed the truth, fear. Around him stood the 4 regents who ruled in his name, Sonnen, Suksahar, Ebelin, and a boy. Their silken robes rustled like the whispers of snakes. They bowed low, but their smiles were sharp. The emperor might have worn the robe, but they carried the power. The empire he inherited was a corpse wearing silk. Rebellions burned in the south, plague ravaged the villages, and corruption rotted the court from within. Ministers bought justice with silver, generals sold loyalty for gold. And at the heart of it all, a child who was supposed to command the mandate of heaven, yet could not even command his own guards. But behind the boy's fear was something the regents did not see, a spark, a curiosity that burned quietly behind his solemn eyes. Kangxi watched everything, the movements of his servants, the tone of the court, the subtle arrogance in Oboi's posture when he addressed him. In silence, the boy learned that survival in the palace was not about strength. It was about patience. His mother, Empress Dowager Xiaozhuang, knew this game better than anyone. Once a concubine, now the silent queen behind the veil, she understood that to keep her son alive, she must let him appear weak. So she whispered lessons into his ear, not of love, but of survival. "Trust no one," she said. "Obey everyone," she added. "And remember, obedience is just a mask for control." Under her guidance, the boy emperor began to listen, not speak. He memorized faces, remembered lies, and studied the court like a hunter learning the habits of his prey. Every punishment, every betrayal, every act of false loyalty, he saw it all. The palace was no longer a home, it was a cage gilded in gold, a school of shadows where innocence was the first casualty. The most dangerous of his regents was Oboi, a war hero whose pride was as vast as his power. He controlled the army, dictated the laws, and treated the emperor as a decorative ornament. In secret, he placed spies in every corner of the court. Even the emperor's meals were chosen by Oboi's men. Kangxi was a prisoner wearing a crown. Years passed under silent tyranny. The child became a youth, and the youth became a shadow. He watched Oboi destroy rivals and humiliate ministers, but never once did he reveal his anger. He smiled when he was expected to smile, bowed when he was told to bow, and in that obedience he hid his greatest weapon, patience. The empire, for all its ceremonies, had forgotten that patience is sharper than any sword. By the time Kangxi turned 14, whispers began to circulate: the boy emperor has grown quiet, too quiet. Some said he was timid, others that he was simple. Oboi believed both, and that was his first mistake. Behind the marble walls of the inner court, Kangxi gathered allies of his own. Tutors, eunuchs, guards, people loyal not to Oboi, but to the true Son of Heaven. He began to issue secret orders through his mother's trusted attendants. Oboi's enemies found protection, his spies began to disappear, and his power, so long unchallenged, started to fracture. And then came the day of reckoning. It was a bright spring morning when Oboi entered the palace, expecting to preside over a routine audience. But the boy emperor, now 16, sat taller than ever before. His voice, calm and deliberate, cut through the hall. "General Oboi," Kangxi said, "you have served the throne long enough." The court froze. The words were soft, but in them, centuries of imperial authority thundered. Before Oboi could react, imperial guards surrounded him. For the first time, the man who had ruled China through fear found himself powerless before the child he had underestimated. Oboi was arrested, stripped of titles, and thrown into the same dungeon where he had sent countless victims to die. The court trembled, and for the first time, the boy was no longer seen as a puppet. He was the emperor, and his silence had become his sword. In the stillness that followed, Kangxi stood before the dragon throne, the same seat that once swallowed him whole. The boy who had been chained by regents now commanded the empire that had nearly devoured him. The innocence of childhood was gone, replaced by something colder, resolve. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and endless. But this time it did not fall on a prisoner, it fell on a ruler. The throne was no longer too large for him, he had grown into it, and soon, the world would learn that the quiet boy had become the most powerful emperor on earth. The dragon throne no longer trembled beneath a child, it now carried the weight of a man determined to rebuild a shattered empire with fire in his veins and iron in his hands. When Kangxi seized full control, China was an empire stitched together by fear, rebellion and exhaustion. The wounds of civil war had festered for decades. The mighty Qing Dynasty, only newly established, was still viewed as a foreign invader by millions of Han Chinese who longed for the old Ming order. Every province bore scars of revolt, and famine stalked the land like a ghost. But from the ashes of chaos, Kangxi began to forge something the world had never seen before, a unified empire bound by both terror and grace. The emperor's first test came not from outsiders, but from within his own empire. 3 former Ming generals, Wu Sangui, Zheng Jingzhong and Shang Kexi, who had once surrendered to the Qing, now ruled vast southern territories as their own kingdoms. They commanded armies, minted their own coins, and whispered rebellion. The empire's southern heart was slipping away. When Kangxi's ministers begged him to compromise, to let the feudatories keep their fiefdoms in peace, the emperor refused. His voice, calm but cold, echoed in the hall of supreme harmony. There cannot be 2 suns in the sky, nor 2 masters under heaven. Thus began the 3 feudatories' rebellion, a brutal civil war that would define the emperor's rule. The flames of rebellion spread across southern China, from Yunnan to Guangdong. Cities burned, fields turned to ash, and rivers ran red. But Kangxi was relentless. He commanded his generals with surgical precision, sending loyal Manchu bannermen to crush the rebels 1 province at a time. For 8 years the empire bled. When at last the rebellion fell and the head of Wu Sangui was brought before him, Kangxi did not rejoice. He simply stared into the hollow eyes of the traitor and whispered, "Peace demands sacrifice." By crushing the feudatories, he did not just win a war, he reasserted the authority of the throne. China once again had 1 emperor, 1 rule, and 1 unbreakable will. Yet victory brought with it a heavy silence. The empire's fields lay scorched, its rivers filled with corpses, and entire generations vanished without names. The dragon had restored order, but its claws were soaked in blood. Still, Kangxi's ambitions did not stop at the mainland. Across the sea, another rebel, Zhang Keshuang, the grandson of Ming loyalist Zhang Chenggong, ruled from the island of Taiwan. For decades, the Zhang family had defied the Qing, claiming Taiwan as the last bastion of the fallen Ming dynasty. Kangxi, determined to erase even the memory of Ming resistance, launched a naval campaign, an empire of horsemen learning to master the sea. In 1683, his fleets, led by Admiral Shi Lang, crushed the Zhang navy in a decisive battle near the Penghu Islands. When news of victory reached Beijing, Kangxi smiled faintly. The empire, for the first time in a century, was whole. From the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the tropical coasts of Taiwan, all bowed before the dragon throne. Yet, even in triumph, there was unease. Behind every parade and proclamation of victory lay silence, the silence of families torn apart, soldiers buried nameless, and scholars executed for doubting imperial rule. The emperor's peace was not born of mercy, it was carved from obedience enforced by fear. Amid this new order, Kangxi found fascination in the unlikeliest of allies, Jesuit missionaries from Europe. They arrived in Beijing not as conquerors, but as scholars carrying instruments of the heavens, telescopes, clocks, and maps. Kangxi, ever curious, welcomed them into his court. He was captivated by their mastery of astronomy and mathematics. The Jesuits, led by figures like Ferdinand Verbiest, helped the emperor reform the imperial calendar, a symbol of heavenly legitimacy. With the stars themselves now under his control, Kangxi strengthened the divine image of his rule. But his embrace of Western knowledge was strategic, not spiritual. He never allowed the missionaries to convert freely or challenge imperial law. They were tools of power, instruments of the emperor's intellect. He once remarked to Verbiest, "Your science pleases heaven. Your faith pleases your God. But remember, under heaven, all things serve the emperor." Through this delicate dance of diplomacy and domination, Kangxi turned foreign science into imperial propaganda. The stars now moved to his command, both literally and symbolically. As the empire rebuilt itself, prosperity bloomed. Roads and canals were restored, famine relief expanded, and the granaries of the empire filled once more. Scholars called it the dawn of a golden age, but beneath the surface a darker truth festered. Kangxi's ministers lived in quiet terror. His secret police roamed the provinces, hunting for whispers of rebellion. Every edict carried the weight of death. The emperor's face appeared on countless portraits, serene, divine, but those who stood before him in person often left trembling. To the people, he was the saintly emperor. To his court, he was something else entirely, a god who smiled with the face of a man. And yet, even in the quiet of the palace, Kangxi often walked alone through the candlelit halls, his silk robes brushing against cold marble. He would gaze at the great map of the empire, the land he had unified through blood and brilliance, and feel an ache he could not name. Peace had been achieved, yes, but it was a peace paid for with lives, with silence and with fear. As the candles flickered around him, Kangxi whispered softly to himself, "Order is not harmony, it is merely control." And somewhere in the vast darkness beyond the walls, the empire's heart continued to beat, steady, powerful, but never free. The forbidden city glittered under a veil of frost and candlelight, its walls echoing with whispers instead of footsteps. By the late 1680s, Emperor Kangxi's China seemed calm, a vast, ordered empire stretching farther than any living ruler could dream. But beneath that calm shimmered an ocean of deceit. The emperor had learned one truth that ruled his every breath: peace was a performance, and loyalty was only ever rented, never earned. Every official in his court bowed deeply, spoke softly, and smiled obediently. Yet Kangxi knew that behind every reverent gesture knives waited. So he built a new kind of empire, one of shadows and secrets. His palaces became theaters of deception, where no one knew who was watching or who was listening. The Son of Heaven had transformed himself into the quiet architect of a vast web of spies. Kangxi's agents came in many forms: eunuchs disguised as servants, scholars pretending to copy imperial documents, couriers who carried blank scrolls concealing hidden messages. They reported everything: which minister spoke too freely over wine, which general showed hesitation in the field, which prince looked too long at the throne. Kangxi demanded their reports in private, reading them by candlelight long after midnight. He rarely slept. The emperor's paranoia was not without reason. He had witnessed too many betrayals in his youth, regents who tried to control him, courtiers who plotted his downfall. Now, even his own triumphs haunted him. The more powerful he became, the more enemies he imagined lurking in the dark. An empire, he once said, cannot fall to its enemies if it first devours its traitors. And so, the devouring began. Behind the grand spectacles of court banquets and poetry readings, ministers vanished overnight. Some were accused of corruption, others of treason, and some simply disappeared with no word at all. Kangxi's justice was swift and silent. A single brushstroke on a hidden edict could condemn a man and erase his name from history. The people called it the Emperor's Whisper. Yet beneath his cold precision was an obsession that bordered on madness. Kangxi's thirst for knowledge, for control, consumed him. He read everything: legal petitions, private letters, even the writings of Jesuit priests. He built secret chambers within the forbidden city where he stored his private notes, imperial orders, and coded instructions. Knowledge was power, but it also became poison. The emperor began to trust information more than people. Occasionally, Kangxi disguised himself as a merchant or scholar and wandered the streets of Beijing. He wanted to hear his people's unfiltered voices, what they thought of their ruler, of his taxes, of his wars. Cloaked and unguarded, he walked among beggars and vendors, watching how they lived, listening to their gossip. Some nights, he returned to the palace with a faint smile. Other nights, he returned furious, convinced that lies had spread even to the lowest corners of the empire. And so, the machinery of fear turned ever faster. Ministers began spying on one another to prove their loyalty. Generals intercepted their own letters before the emperor could. Even Kangxi's sons learned to speak in riddles, afraid that a careless word could end their future. The palace, once a seat of divine authority, became a nest of suspicion. But it was not all darkness. Kangxi's secret network also strengthened his reign. His spies uncovered rebellions before they began, exposed plots in border provinces, and even brought down corrupt governors who had been untouchable for decades. The empire was orderly because fear had made it so. The people called him the listening emperor, the ruler who knew everything before it was spoken. Still, at night, when the palace fell silent, Kangxi's mind would not rest. He often reread his secret reports, memorizing every word as though they were sacred texts. He wanted to believe that knowledge alone could keep him safe. But deep down, he understood a cruel truth. The more he knew, the less he trusted. One winter evening, during a banquet honoring the new year, Kangxi sat in silence while the court toasted his long reign. Candles flickered across the golden hall, casting shadows that moved like ghosts. As laughter filled the room, the emperor watched his ministers raise their cups, smiling faces glowing in firelight. For a brief moment, he saw not men but masks, 1,000 painted faces smiling at him while plotting in their hearts. That night, after the festivities, he summoned his secret guard captain and gave a quiet order. By dawn, 3 ministers had been arrested, 1 poisoned, and 2 vanished without trace. The court understood the message. Loyalty in Kangxi's China was measured not in devotion, but in survival. By the end of his 5th decade on the throne, Kangxi had mastered the art of ruling from the shadows. His empire flourished, his enemies were silenced, and his power was absolute. Yet the emperor himself had become what he most feared, a prisoner of his own vigilance. Surrounded by spies, haunted by secrets, he ruled an empire that obeyed him without question, but he could no longer tell where truth ended and deception began. The Son of Heaven was untouchable, but utterly alone. The forbidden city no longer echoed with songs of victory. By the dawn of Kangxi's later years, the empire he had built stood stronger than ever, its borders secure, its coffers overflowing, and its name feared across Asia. Yet within the vermilion walls of his own palace, the greatest war of his life had just begun. It was not a war of nations or generals, but of sons. Kangxi had fathered more than 35 princes, each born to different mothers, each raised under the weight of imperial expectation. In the beginning, he believed he could shape them into loyal servants of the throne. He taught them the arts of governance, the discipline of Confucian learning, the strategies of war, but he had forgotten one lesson: that history never stops teaching. Power corrupts blood faster than any poison. Whispers began to swirl through the silk corridors, whispers of jealousy, of betrayal, of ambition clothed in filial duty. Concubines plotted for their sons, eunuchs carried messages between rival factions, and brothers who once studied together now eyed each other like wolves. The imperial nursery had become a battlefield long before the emperor realized it. At first, Kangxi's favorite was his second son, Yinreng, the crown prince he adored since infancy. The boy was bright, eloquent, and fiercely intelligent, the image of what Kangxi had once been. He gave Yinreng everything: the best tutors, his personal horse, even the right to preside over court in his absence. The court believed the succession was settled, but beneath the silk of that certainty, rot was spreading. As Yinreng grew older, power began to twist him. Surrounded by flatterers and spies of his own, he became arrogant, indulgent, and cruel. He extorted ministers, punished servants for imagined slights, and whispered that one day he would rule without mercy. Kangxi ignored the rumors at first, a father's blindness clouding an emperor's judgment. But when his spies brought proof of Yinreng's treachery, secret plots to seize the throne before the emperor's death, the illusion shattered. In a moment of volcanic rage, Kangxi ordered his beloved heir imprisoned. The boy who was once his pride now knelt before him in chains, trembling as the emperor's voice thundered through the hall. "You have betrayed not just me," Kangxi said, "but heaven itself." The decree that followed struck like lightning. The crown prince was deposed, stripped of his title, and erased from public record. The court gasped. Ministers who had once sworn loyalty to Yinreng now turned on him like vultures, offering evidence of his corruption. Kangxi's grief was silent but immeasurable. He had lost not just a son, but his future. Yet even that was not the end. Years later, Kangxi, worn by loneliness and regret, allowed himself to hope again. He reinstated Yinreng as crown prince, believing that punishment had tamed his arrogance. But history repeated itself, crueler than before. The prince's conspiracies returned, darker and more reckless. He spoke of rebellion, of overthrowing the dragon throne before it could pass him by. When Kangxi learned of this second betrayal, something inside him broke. The emperor did not rage this time. He simply whispered, "Remove him." Yinreng was taken away quietly into a lifetime of confinement, a prince turned ghost within the palace. His name was never spoken again. But the fall of one heir only deepened the chaos. Each of Kangxi's remaining sons began to believe heaven favored them instead. Factions formed. The fourth prince, Yongzheng, cold and calculating; the eighth prince, Yinsi, charming but treacherous; the 13th, loyal yet dangerously ambitious. They bribed courtiers, sabotaged one another's allies, and poisoned the emperor's trust one drop at a time. Kangxi watched as his dynasty devoured itself. The palace that once symbolized divine order now pulsed with paranoia. Servants were executed for overheard conversations. Letters were burned unread. The emperor began to suspect that heaven itself had cursed his bloodline. Some nights, Kangxi would wander the ancestral temple, staring at the names of emperors before him. His whispers to the stone tablets were never recorded, but historians imagined their meaning. "Why must a throne demand the blood of those who should love me most?" As his sons tore each other apart, Kangxi grew quieter, more withdrawn. He attended fewer councils, dined alone, and spent long hours studying old records, perhaps searching for wisdom that no longer existed. The same emperor who had crushed rebellions, tamed the steppe tribes, and humbled the Jesuits could not conquer the rebellion within his own family. In his private writings, Kangxi described the feeling of betrayal not as pain, but as fatigue. "I have ruled for too long," he confessed, "and now I am surrounded only by those who wish me dead or gone." When the emperor's health began to fail, the palace held its breath. No one knew whom he would name as successor. To choose one son meant declaring war on all the others. Kangxi delayed his decision, hoping time might reveal virtue among them. But time, as ever, was merciless. By the end, the once mighty emperor sat surrounded by scrolls, edicts, and the ghosts of sons who had disappointed him. The laughter of children that once filled the palace had long been replaced by silence. Kangxi realized that power, the very thing he had spent his life mastering, had destroyed the only thing he could never rebuild: his family. In the final years of his reign, the dragon throne glittered brighter than ever, yet the man who sat upon it was hollow. He had outlived rebellion, plague, and betrayal. But within those marble walls, surrounded by fear and ambition, Kangxi had discovered the cruelest truth of all, that the greatest enemies of an emperor are not found on battlefields, they are born under his own roof. The palace was quiet, too quiet. The drums of war had stopped long ago, the empire's borders stretched farther than ever before, and the people whispered Kangxi's name with reverence. Yet inside the Forbidden City, silence had become his only companion. He had ruled longer than any emperor before him, 61 years on the dragon throne. He had outlived enemies, outmaneuvered traitors, and buried friendlies. But immortality, he now realized, was not a gift from heaven. It was a punishment. In his youth, Kangxi had been fire, commanding armies, exploring science, defying fate. Now he was a shadow drifting through the palace he once ruled like a god. His steps go down empty corridors as he passed the portraits of ministers and generals long dead. Each face reminded him of victory, but also of loss. The empire still lived, yet the man who had built it was slowly fading. He spent his mornings reading petitions, though fewer reached him now. His sons had become governors and princes, running the empire in his name. His courtiers bowed lower than ever, but their eyes were hollow with calculation. They were waiting, not for his orders, but for his death. Kangxi could see it in their stillness, in the way their voices softened around him, as though speaking too loudly might summon heaven's decree to take him away. In the afternoons, he walked through his gardens, where the trees he had planted decades ago now towered above him. He touched their trunks and whispered, "You, at least, have grown as I wished." He watched the koi swim beneath the frozen pond surface in winter and thought of the young emperor he once was, a boy who had believed he could rule forever, but forever had turned into loneliness. His most trusted generals, men like Wu Sangui and Shi Lang, had long been reduced to names in dusty scrolls. His mothers, wives, and concubines were gone. Even his favorite empress, who once soothed his temper and shared his burdens, now rested beneath the cold marble of the imperial mausoleum. The children who had once laughed in his arms were dead or estranged. The court still called him Son of Heaven, but Kangxi felt more like a ghost among the living. Each night, he summoned historians to record his life, not out of vanity but out of fear. Fear that one day his legacy would be rewritten, that his enemies would twist his story. He ordered detailed archives to be kept, chronicling not only his victories but his personal reflections. He wanted history to remember the truth, yet even he began to doubt what that truth was. Sometimes he would pause over the scrolls and ask aloud, "Was I a good emperor?" The historians dared not answer. He would smile faintly then, as if understanding. "History will decide," he murmured, but history never loved a man. In the later years, Kangxi's health began to crumble. His hands trembled when holding the brush. The imperial physicians, terrified to admit his decline, prescribed exotic remedies, deer antler, pearl powder, and elixirs of immortality that only poisoned him further. Still, he continued to rise before dawn, to read reports from the farthest corners of his realm. Even when he could no longer stand for long, he insisted on being carried to the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where he would stare at the empty throne, the same golden seat he had once feared as a child. That throne had outlasted everyone he had ever loved. One evening, as the last light of day spilled across the Forbidden City's rooftops, Kangxi summoned his remaining sons. He looked upon them, not as heirs or rivals, but as fragments of his own weary soul. "You see the empire I built," he said softly, "but you do not see the price." His gaze fell upon Yongzheng, the fourth prince, whose calm demeanor hid a mind sharp as a blade. Kangxi saw in him both the cunning and cruelty needed to rule, perhaps too much of both. Still, he hesitated. Choosing a successor meant signing his own death warrant. The moment the empire knew who would inherit, his own life would lose all value. But time was running out. His breath grew shorter, his body weaker. The emperor who once commanded a continent now struggled to command his own heartbeat. When winter came, Kangxi's condition worsened. The imperial doctors gathered like mourners in advance, whispering that heaven's mandate was preparing to return to the skies. On a cold December night, the emperor asked to be left alone. Servants obeyed, retreating silently, leaving only the flicker of oil lamps. He sat there for hours staring at the ceiling beams painted with dragons. "How strange," he murmured, "that a man can rule the world but not his own soul." He thought of his youth, of his first victories, of the faces that time had taken from him. Then, perhaps for the first time, he allowed himself to rest. By morning, Kangxi was gone, his body still seated upright as though meditating. The Son of Heaven had returned to the heavens. When the court discovered his death, the Forbidden City erupted in ritual mourning. Bells tolled across Beijing. Officials wept publicly, though many hid relief behind their tears. The empire that Kangxi had ruled for 61 years now belonged to another, his chosen successor Yongzheng. And yet, as the new emperor sat upon the dragon throne, the shadow of his father loomed over him. Every edict, every reform, every whisper in the corridors carried the same unspoken question: would Yongzheng ever escape Kangxi's ghost? Because Kangxi had achieved what no conqueror, no scholar, no tyrant had before. He had outlived time itself. His rule became legend, his name a myth whispered across centuries. But behind the grandeur, history would forever remember the truth he could never escape. That power, no matter how absolute, always demands the same price: solitude. And in the end, the mightiest emperor of the Qing Dynasty died not as a ruler surrounded by subjects, but as a man surrounded by memories, the last survivor of his own greatness. The forbidden city lay wrapped in the silence of morning. The golden roofs shimmered beneath a pale winter sun, and the air hung heavy with incense and grief. But as the echo of funeral drums faded, another sound began to rise, the sound of ambition. Kangxi was dead, but his empire, vast and glittering, still pulsed with life. And within that life, seeds of decay were already stirring. The dragon throne had a new master, Yongzheng, Kangxi's son. His ascension was swift, but not without whispers. Some said the will had been altered. Others murmured that the throne had been stolen in the dead of night. No one dared speak these words aloud. Yet they lingered in every hall, behind every bowed head. For 61 years, Kangxi had been the sun. His death had left shadows long enough for men to disappear within them. Yongzheng was a different kind of emperor. Cold, precise, relentless. Where Kangxi ruled with charisma and patience, Yongzheng ruled with fear and order. He sought to perfect what his father had built, but his obsession with control became his curse. He tightened laws, silenced dissent, and punished even minor corruption with execution. The empire that Kangxi had expanded with iron and silk was now bound in chains of bureaucracy. Officials once inspired by loyalty now moved like ghosts, terrified of a single mistake. The emperor's secret police prowled the streets, collecting whispers, vanishing courtiers in the night. Kangxi's golden age of reason had turned into an era of suspicion. The great empire that once celebrated enlightenment now feared its own reflection. Yet beneath the surface of terror, something else was dying, the spirit of the dynasty itself. Kangxi's rule had united Manchu and Han, warlords and scholars east and west. But Yongzheng's paranoia drove them apart. The Jesuit scientists once welcomed to court were expelled, their telescopes dismantled, their knowledge viewed as dangerous foreign sorcery. Libraries that Kangxi had filled with curiosity were sealed shut. In his zeal to preserve his father's legacy, Yongzheng strangled it. Outside the palace, famine crept through the countryside. Corruption returned, this time hidden under layers of red tape. Local officials taxed peasants to starvation, while imperial inspectors doctored reports to protect themselves. The mighty empire of Kangxi, once described as the center of the world, began to rot from within, invisible at first, then unmistakable. Still, the emperor refused to see it. My father ruled by benevolence, he told his ministers. Hond men loved him, but feared not the law. I will rule by discipline, and they will fear me enough to obey. It worked for a time. Grain moved, taxes rose, and order returned. But beneath that order, resentment grew like roots beneath the marble floors of the forbidden city. When Yongzheng finally died, his son Qianlong inherited a kingdom both powerful and fragile, a golden mask covering a cracked face. Under Qianlong's reign, China would shine again, dazzling the world with art, architecture, and wealth. But the cracks only deepened. The bureaucracy Kangxi had built became bloated. The scholars he once empowered turned sycophants, and the emperors who followed became trapped within the cage of ceremony he had once designed. The Qing Dynasty endured for another 2 centuries, but the rot that began in Kangxi's shadow never stopped spreading. The empire that once tamed rebels and scholars alike eventually found itself unable to tame its own stagnation. When foreign ships appeared on the horizon centuries later, armed with cannons and demands, the descendants of Kangxi, heirs to the mandate of heaven, could only watch as their once immortal empire began to crumble. Historians would later call Kangxi's reign the High Qing era, the peak of Chinese civilization. But history is a cruel judge. The same systems that had brought prosperity also planted the seeds of weakness. Kangxi's reliance on absolute control, his creation of a bureaucratic maze, and his obsession with perfection left no room for failure, and thus no room for renewal. Even after his death, his influence haunted the empire. Every emperor who followed was compared to him, and none could surpass him. Kangxi had become a standard too high to reach, a shadow too vast to escape. He had wanted immortality through legacy, and he achieved it. But that immortality came with a curse. The very greatness that defined his dynasty would also destroy it. In the centuries that followed, poets would write of Kangxi's rule with reverence and melancholy. The dragon sat too long upon the throne. One wrote, "His fire warmed the world, but left the ashes cold." His reign became legend, a memory of order in a world that had fallen apart. And yet, behind the beauty of that legend lay the truth that history rarely tells, that greatness always demands a sacrifice, and the higher the empire climbs, the harder it falls. Today, the name Kangxi still echoes through history books and museum halls, carved into stone and painted in gold. His empire is gone, but his story endures, a warning whispered across time. Because in the end, the legacy of the Dragon Throne is not one of eternal glory. It is the story of a man who built perfection with his hands, only to discover that perfection cannot survive its creator. His empire became his monument, and his monument became his tomb. And as the centuries passed, the question Kangxi once asked himself still lingers like incense in the wind: was I a good emperor? No answer ever came, only silence. The kind that follows after greatness has burned itself out,